Hi, and welcome to Two Nerds, One Pod. I am Jake.
And I'm Scott.
And we have a special guest today. Asher, say hello.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm fine. It's Saturday.
Today we're talking about what, Scott?
So we had a topic that we were thinking it's pretty specific, but it's also a fascinating topic, and I think a lot of people can relate to a certain incident and that they've experienced in their lives, but it's going to be about nuclear disasters.
I feel like I have to point out that you first messaged me and were like, hey, we want to have you on the pod, but you initially said you wanted to talk about baseball, and that might be too specific for our crowd. And then I was jokingly like, oh, the other thing I'm into is nuclear accidents. And Scott was like, yeah, that works. And then I listened to last week's, and it's about aging, like the universal human experience. And now it's like, baseball's too specific, but let's talk about atoms for peace.
You could also change the topic. You have a very valid point, yeah? We would all have to think of a topic on the spot, though.
Calling us out on the recording.
It's like a metaphor, I feel like, for my life. That's how it is when I talk about baseball. Like, I don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about literally anything else.
Well, I say we
just charge ahead. We're doing great so far.
For it, yeah. So I would say, since you suggested the topic, Asher, is there a particular nuclear disaster that you have in mind?
I recently gave a presentation at work about the Windscale fire, which I think is a pretty wild story.
I have no idea what that is. Could you tell me?
I've never even heard of that.
Yeah, nobody's heard it. It was England's first real nuclear production facility, and also their first and only nuclear disaster. And nobody knows about it, even in England.
So what time frame are we looking at? What period of time?
The fire happened in 1957, and the plant was operating for a few years before that, maybe not even that long. But yeah, post World War II.
So this is early nuclear reactor, kind of.
Yes, kind of. I mean, it was, once the U.S. dropped the A-bombs in World War II, everybody was like, oh, so they can do that now. And we were like, yes, we're not telling anybody else how to do it. And that included the UK. And they were like, oh, come on, man. So this was they had to play catch up with us. No, seriously, Windscale wasn't made to generate power. It was only made to make nuclear weapons material.
Really?
Because once other people set off bombs, we'd be like, all right, cool, you come hang out in our shitty clubhouse.
This might be derailing you a bit, Asher, but for whatever reason, I thought bombs were dropped, and we went to our allies and we're like, yo, here's the secret. This is what it is. I guess I didn't know it was more like figure out your own shit and then you can come chill with us.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of, the UK was involved in the Manhattan Project, but they weren't given all of the documents and stuff, and they weren't involved at every step. We were just better at it also for a lot of reasons. Part of it is just by virtue of where the U.S. is and how it's shaped and where things are located here.
And the materials probably, too, that you need, right?
Yeah. But, part of it is that, the Windscale was their Hanford site, which was what made all of the plutonium for the Manhattan Project. The Hanford site was this huge graphite-moderated, water-cooled, open-loop reactor. Open-loop reactor design is an insane thing that we do not do anymore for very good and very obvious reasons, because it means that you're cooling the reactor. At the Hanford site, they literally just built it next to a river and diverted the river through the reactor.
Like a water wheel.
They just had the water flow over the reactor to keep it cool. And it went into a holding pond for however long the half-life was of the stuff in it, and then just went right back into the river.
Wow. Okay.
But for obvious reasons, open-loop cooling is bad. It shouldn't be part of your design. And the problem with that is that if the water stops for whatever reason, the whole reactor explodes.
So if there's a drought or
if the pumps fail.
Oh, I see.
Which the U.S. got around by being like, we have these incredibly specific guidelines for where you can build this plant. And it had to be 30 miles away from cities over X size. And there were all these lines of if the population center is this big, it has to be X amount of space
because of
away.
The fallout or what?
Yeah, because if it did explode, it was all right, people aren't living there. And they built this big highway for everybody to evacuate on. So the UK government looked into the same siting rules, and there were two places they could put it. And both of them were the ass end of nowhere in Scotland and Wales, which for other reasons is not a great place to build your nuclear weapons plants. So the lesson they learned was that they needed to make a open loop air-cooled graphite moderated reactor, which is also a tremendously bad idea.
Why is that a bad idea?
because it means that you're just blowing air across it, and so now the air with all the radioactive stuff is just going out into the atmosphere.
Wait, an
Oh, right.
air-cooled reactor?
Yeah.
And is that what happened at the Wyndham site that you're talking about?
Yeah, Windscale was just a huge graphite moderated open loop air cooled reactor.
So it would just gas off the air straight off the reactor?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it wasn't meant for power generation. So what it was literally these like fuck off huge graphite blocks with holes drilled through it. And they were arranged in like 5 side of a dice. So there were 4 fuel channels, and then in the middle was where they would put the stuff that they were trying to convert into whatever the weapons stuff was. Because pretty much you like irradiate stuff at a certain rate, and it becomes something else, and then that does other things. So they would like manually push this stuff through these channels with it's insane. It's insane, and it's not that like the things that they were doing were not that out of line for the time period, but the scale and the speed at which they were doing it was like crazy because they were playing catch up.
So they were just enriching uranium, is that right?
It's not uranium enrichment. It's like making weapons grade plutonium, which is a different thing. They were making plutonium, and then they were making something else later on for hydrogen bombs, which was much more complicated. But it's a uranium enrichment is making it more radioactive, is my understanding. Whereas like weapons grade stuff is actually converting its chemistry into something more reactive in most cases, I think.
So were they firing photons or molecules, electrons at the material and converting it that way? Is that right?
Yeah, you have this big block of moderating material in the graphite, which slows down the radiation products, which encourages it to collide with stuff, which creates the heat and the reaction you're after.
Gotcha, yeah. So what was the fallout then from all this? How much did it affect the population?
Well, what happened was the U.S. found out about it and sent some guys over to be like, hey, listen, we're not going to tell you how to do this, but we also want to make sure you don't kill everybody.
Oh, thanks.
So, like, because, like, there's all these lessons that we learned during the Manhattan Project, which were obviously incredibly classified and never talked about. And then, we heard that the UK wanted to build this enormous graphite reactor and went over like, hey, you guys need to know about this thing called Wigner growth, which is that when you irradiate graphite, the neutrons from the radiation knock carbon atoms out of alignment in the physical lattice of the graphite, which changes its shape over time.
So does that weaken the graphite then?
It doesn't weaken it necessarily, but it like literally will change the shape of the graphite blocks, which is bad when you are pushing fuel through these specifically drilled channels. And so the Brits were like, all right, cool, what do we do? And they were like, you just design around it. And they were like, we've already built the reactor. So, and also they used, the graphite they used was different than the graphite the US used. So it also behaved completely differently with regards to Wigner growth.
In a negative or positive way?
Negative way. It was way less predictable. But the good news is you can anneal that out of it. The bad news is by annealing the reactor just means turning the cooling off and letting it get hot.
So then how did the fire happen?
The fire happened actually when they were making material for hydrogen bombs, which was a whole other can of worms because, what they did was they kept making the weapon material pellets bigger on the inside, which meant thinner casing material. So they would burst with some regularity, which is bad because then the radioactive stuff inside can get out. But we're still talking about like pretty small amounts of stuff getting out. The other problem is that the material you are like transmuting for this hydrogen thing is a neutron poisoner. So you need way more fuel around it.
Poisoner?
Yeah, so it will absorb the neutrons coming off of the nuclear fuel, which will stop the fission reaction if you don't put more fuel in.
Interesting.
So the other thing, there's Wigner growth, and then there's also Wigner energy, which is that when the Wigner growth happens, all of this energy gets stored up in the graphite, and it will just like randomly release itself at some point in the future. This is also solved by annealing. But the annealing process is also not a science. It's just like a thing you have to do, and you have to figure out how to do it. And it was like the way that the Windscale reactor was built, the dudes would sit in the room and like pull specific control rods from specific places to specific depths to heat specific parts of the pile. It's wild. It's an amazing thing. But
like annealing like traditional metals? Because like with annealing, you usually just add heat, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you were doing, but in this case, you were adding heat by like localizing parts of the reactor to react more.
Weird. Okay.
Yeah, it's wild stuff. But they're doing the annealing at some point in fall of 1957, and they start getting these like wild temperature readings from a bunch of places that shouldn't be giving wild temperature readings. Like, long story short, they go down there one day and they open the fueling door on one of the sections where they're getting the weird temperature readings. And it's thousands of tons of graphite underground with holes drilled through it. So you open these things and it's supposed to just be like black on black on black, like nothing. And they open the thing and there's just all this red light coming out of it. It's like, oh, this is very bad. Things are very bad here.
This is fine.
Yeah. So what ended up happening was one of the casings burst and it got jammed in there, and everything got too hot and it caught on fire. So they push all of the, they start ramming all of the fuel out of the back of the face of this thing with metal rods, as one does. Eventually, the graphite literally catches fire, which is the thing the U.S. was like, listen, there's one thing that you cannot let happen. The graphite cannot catch fire. Because if you put water on the graphite, it creates a shitload of hydrogen gas, and then that hydrogen gas explodes, and that's very bad. That's not a good thing.
Well, I'm sure it's ungodly hot, too, right? It's not just like on fire. Like, everything is just hot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that gets really hot but doesn't catch fire. So when it does catch fire, it's like, oh, this is too hot. It's too hot now.
I mean, graphite, Jesus, that's got to be really hot, right?
Yeah, The thing is, the reason it's so bad when the graphite catches fire is because when you put water on it, it creates a bunch of hydrogen, and the hydrogen blows up, and then you destroy your containment facility and all that. Which, like, I don't think I don't think I have to explain why, like, turning your nuclear weapons program into a dirty bomb is a bad thing. But I guess the air quotes good news is that when you have an open loop air cooled reactor pile, I guess a lot of the hydrogen just blew out the smokestacks because it didn't explode, and they ended up putting out the fire within like a couple days, mostly by starving it of oxygen.
And what was the damage to the area? Like, how many people were living there?
The damage was not too bad, because this is another thing that the Americans like told them after they had already started building the smokestacks. Like, hey, you got to filter this. You got to filter this stuff. So they had these filters at the top of the smokestacks, which were these like just an insane contraption. So they had the filters on the top of the stacks, which kept stuff in. But also, this is a common theme through a lot of like nuclear meltdowns, is that you get these exotic materials interacting in ways that they were not intended to, and they end up creating like their own shell around things in a lot of cases. It happened at 3 Mile Island also. But what happened here is that there was like this really thin material of some kind that formed around the whole thing, which helped keep a lot of the radioactive stuff in.
What they were doing?
Just because of the chemistry of what happens when a reactor catches fire, is that there's just like all this weird shit that doesn't usually mix. The biggest issue with the release was a bunch of iodine 131 got out, which has a pretty short half-life of only like, I think it's only a few weeks. And it's also pretty heavy, so it falls out of the air pretty quickly. But they built this in the middle of like relative nowhere, which was surrounded by dairy farms. So all of the cows ate the radioactive grass and got irradiated. So the UK government just bought all of the milk from the region for like a month and dumped it in the ocean.
That seems pretty responsible, yeah.
Well, okay, they say they dumped it into the ocean, but there are like local news stories about how the whole area just stank like old milk for a long time, so they might have just dumped it wherever. And then they dumped all of the like radioactive material in the ocean also.
Jesus Christ.
The foresight in the 50s and 60s, especially with these technologies that are so they just have long-term impacts on the environment, right? It's just amazing what they thought was cool.
Yeah, the scale of impact was pretty low on the environment, honestly. I mean, you end up with a bunch of irradiated stuff in the plant itself, but the stuff that came out was not so bad in the grand scheme of things. Like, I think the upper end is 250 extra cancer cases over the people's exposed lifetimes, which, I mean, obviously that is higher than zero, but also I feel like we get cancer all the time now.
I do agree that cancer seems to be more prevalent, either based on our diets or what's in the air due to emissions or whatever. It's quite common, isn't it?
Yeah, the thing that gets out of nuclear disasters that you really, really don't want getting out is strontium-90.
What happens when that gets out?
It just has a really long half-life. It has a 30-year half-life.
It's a heavy metal or what?
It's a strontium isotope, which I guess in a solid form it would look like metal, I guess. I mean, we're talking about like particles.
Yeah, I figured it would be aerated or whatever.
Yeah, and the funny thing about strontium-90 is that it's like all man-made. Like all of the strontium-90 that you can observe on the planet, almost all of it is from nuclear tests and nuclear accidents.
So is it just because it holds the radioactivity longer. Is that?
Yeah. It can take hundreds of years before it's negligible radiation coming off of it. I guess I'm sorry. I'm looking this up in real time right now because I forgot some of the details. The problem with iodine 131 is that the body thinks it's just iodine and will just like cram it into your thyroid, which is obviously real bad. You don't want radioactive stuff inside your thyroid.
Generally not, no.
And strontium 90 is the body can't really differentiate it from calcium, so it will jam it into your bones, which again, bad. You do not want that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you have a spent fuel rod or something, what are the byproducts that are made after that's been spent? Do you know that off the top of your head?
No, I couldn't tell you that off the top of my head, and it also depends on what type of reactor you're pulling it out of. But I do. Another funny thing is the spent fuel stuff, which is that like in the U.S., ideally what we want to do is put it in these casks and like bring it to some centralized repository.
They're all at the individual reactors, though.
Yeah, they all just kind of chill in pools right now because we can't get our shit together. But I remember during a hearing about these things, there was like this big fear that like terrorists would hijack the trucks and like steal the nuclear material and make dirty bombs with it. And so some dude, I think he might have been, I don't know if he was the DOE or what, but they asked the guy like, what? Okay, so somebody hijacks his truck and cuts open the containment cask. What happens? He's like, that problem will solve itself almost instantly. Like whoever did it will like melt into a pile of slurry. Like this stuff is incredibly difficult to be around.
How do they transport it safely then? Like robots or machines or something?
I mean, you put it in a container that can contain the radiation and is like incredibly shockproof. I mean, we're talking about stuff that you could like. I remember seeing a video of them testing the walls that they, not the train car, but like the material that they make the containment vessel for reactors in the U.S. out of, and they crashed an F-4 Phantom jet into it, and the jet like disappears. Like there's nothing left of it afterwards, and there's literally not even a mark on the wall.
Holy shit!
Yeah, I remember I can't remember when. I assume it's like the early 2000s, but they were talking. There was videos on like Discovery or something where they were testing the train cars, and they would just like try to beat the shit out of them, and it was just like the car that it was on would get destroyed or blown up or whatever. But the actual capsule itself that they put the material in would just be completely unmarred.
What are they made out of? Does anyone know?
I mean, I'm pretty sure it's probably classified, but it's like polymers and alloys and concrete and just like, what's the hardest shit you got? We'll take a lot of it.
Okay, yeah.
It's like a black box, It's a
very big, expensive black box.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite nuclear disaster? Like, what's your top 10?
The one that I think is, and I know Asher has opinions about, is I think it's the one in Michigan where like there was a supposed meltdown in Michigan and no one gave a shit and no one knew about it, or there was a close meltdown or something, right, Asher?
Oh, is this the like we almost lost Detroit thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wildly overhyped.
Yeah, so you don't think it was that close?
No. I mean, no. But that was about the Fermi One Reactor, I'm pretty sure.
I don't know that much about it. I just remember.
Yeah, this also it goes back to mid-century. Oh, actually, I guess this was the Fermi. Wait, no, I'm looking at a different. I forget which reactor that. Yes, okay, yeah, it was about the Fermi One Reactor. Yeah, so this was like the 60s, and it was a partial meltdown. And it was also kind of an experimental reactor design. But like it's one of those things where people think that if something goes wrong at a nuclear facility, it turns into a nuclear bomb, that's not how that works. Like it's bad, but it doesn't, you're not going to get a mushroom cloud and a shockwave and like that sort of stuff.
Right, and there's lots of safeguards in general against the things that could happen, right?
Yeah. You have to try really hard to get a nuclear bomb to go off, even in a nuclear bomb. The English found that out when they were trying to catch up with us with the wind scale stuff. It's like, it's hard, even if you want to make it explode, to make this stuff explode in a way that we associate with nuclear stuff blowing up.
Well, like for an H-bomb, you have to have a nuke inside, right? Or something like you really got to force it.
Yeah, pretty much. I don't do math good. So I can't really speak to the specific physics of it. And I'm also not that interested in nuclear weapons because I think that they're bad and we shouldn't have them. And it's not like, there's nothing fun about it.
Yeah.
Fun.
But like, I don't know, nuclear energy is more interesting because it's not like the end result of building a nuclear energy plant is not a shitload of people dying. That's a bad outcome.
Hopefully, yeah.
You're not you don't wake up, you're not drawing the plans with the intent of like we're going to kill everybody.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, the goal, the intent, right, is not to kill as many people as possible. That's fair.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry. You want to go back to? Do you want to talk about Fermi One some more? We kind of got off on a tangent.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was Fermi One was a fast breeder reactor, which suffered a partial meltdown. But one thing about this, one of the things about nuclear disasters in power generation, like Windscale, I think is its own thing because it was entirely a weapons program. But like a lot of people think that when something goes wrong in a nuclear plant, it's like a write-off immediately and that's it. And like the whole thing has been a waste of time. But like Fermi 1, there was an issue with the coolant loop. They didn't realize until probably too late. And by the time they scrammed it, there was a partial meltdown and some of the fuel rods melted and they had to like scrap the existing stuff. But they brought the reactor back online and back up to full power in 1970.
How much later was it? How many years?
Let's see. It was an extended shutdown, so years later.
Yeah.
But there was it's not a complete write-off, and like 3 Mile Island was 2 reactors, the second of which continued to run. The last the last power generating reactor at Chernobyl didn't get turned off until 2000, or maybe sometime in the 90s.
Really?
And there's still RBMK reactors running in Russia and Europe.
What's an RMBK reactor?
That's the design that was used at Chernobyl.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, it looks like, I mean, even to your point, Esther, is that the Fermi reactor that was running was still, they have, one was decommissioned, but the other one is still running, according to this Wikipedia page. So it's still going. Like, it's not like it has a meltdown and it's done. I guess that's the perception of a meltdown.
Yeah, and it depends on the design of the reactor. One of the biggest differences between 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl is that the U.S. design philosophy was a lot more focused on like building this enormous containment vessel to put the reactor core in, whereas the Soviets didn't do that for a whole host of reasons. But there was a hydrogen explosion at 3 Mile Island during the meltdown because they were dumping a ton of water into the core. So a lot of hydrogen got out and it ignited, but because it's in this enormous containment vessel, nobody really knew until afterwards when they were like doing a post-mortem on it. So like this bad. So if you design assuming that the worst case is going to happen, you can design around some of the worst stuff happening. That's probably a bad tautology, but
yeah, if you anticipate that at some point you might have a meltdown or a partial meltdown, then maybe you can make a design that can kind of hinder or at least try to stop that, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm actually backtracking just a little bit, but I think it's really interesting in life that something that you can use uranium for, you could either use it for, let's say, good or evil, right? You could generate power or you could nuke people. I think that's really fascinating that the same element can bring us either on the path of peace or a path of war. I just want to throw that out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like radiation is just a thing that things do. Bananas are radioactive. Like there's nothing inherently moral or amoral about it.
Right, it's just a tool. Yeah, it depends how you use it.
It is to some degree, but I would say it's not even a tool. It's like it's a fact of the universe. It's entropy.
Yeah, true. Yeah, that's a good point. It's just what elements do, right? I was going to ask, India and Pakistan are both nuclear nations, right?
Yes. I mean, I think that when we use that term to describe things, it's specifically with regards to weapons programs.
Okay, but let me rephrase it then. Do you know if there's nuclear power plants in both countries?
I don't know offhand. I would assume they have to have something.
Yeah. The reason I asked is that I'm just wondering if there's ever been an accident in India or Pakistan. I've never heard about any, but I'm wondering.
Yes. Okay. India has 23 reactors at 7 different plants.
Okay. Well, Pakistan, I would imagine, would have less, right? Because just less people.
Yeah, Pakistan's smaller. Pakistan only has 5 operable reactors.
5, okay. Yeah, I've never heard about any accidents there, so I was just wondering maybe if you knew. But if you don't know offhand, that's fine. No worries.
Yeah, I haven't heard about anything. I mean, part of it is also, I guess, is looking at this, the issue is that Pakistan is not in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means that people won't help them get access to reactor stuff because the thought is that they'll use it to build weapons materials.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Speaking of which, wasn't there a plant recently destroyed in Iran? Was sabotaged or something?
That was like Stuxnet, right? Where they broke all the centrifuges. That again is okay. Well, the reason that the UK at Windscale and part of the reason that the RBMK reactor at Chernobyl was designed the way it was is because they didn't have to use enriched uranium,
Okay.
which has been through very complicated and fancy scientific processes made more radioactive. The US generally uses enriched uranium designs in like all of our reactors, the ones in the Navy, the ones that we use for power generation. Then the problem is that enriched uranium for power plant use is like, it's called low enriched, and I forget the exact percentage that it's enriched to, but there's low enrichment which can't be used for nuclear weapons, and then there's high enrichment which can. But the problem is that if you have the capability to get to low enrichment, it's like the curve to get to high enrichment. It's very easy to go from low enrichment to high enrichment. So if you have the capability to do low enrichment, it's very easy to get to high enrichment from there, which is why the whole Iran nuclear thing is such a big deal. Because they say they want to just they want power generation capabilities, which for safe reactor design at this point pretty much requires enriched uranium.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also then enrich that uranium just a little bit further in terms of like effort and scale and get weapons grade material. And part of this is because the entirety of nuclear research has pretty much been in service of weapons, and the ability to generate power was like a happy secondary accident.
Didn't they refuse the inspectors in for a long time to their plant?
Maybe.
The UN inspectors, yeah. I seem to recall that there was something where they had the enrichment facility, and then at first they were cooperating. I don't know who is like the atom bomb police, the nuclear police, but there's an organization that does it, right? And they have
It's the IAEA, either the IAEA and or UN.
Yeah, I assume it's probably the former. But they had inspectors that were going to Iran, and then one day Iran just said, "No, you can't go in anymore." So that's pretty suspicious. Yeah.
Yes, that this is politics more than it is anything about nuclear materials or anything like that. But it's like I don't think that the inspections regime was this like apolitical thing that was created with the intent of being as fair as possible. I mean, part of it was also just that all the talks broke down. It was the U.S. and Israel being like, we don't want you to have any enrichment capability at all. And like Israel also has nuclear weapons, but is part of the non-proliferation treaty or something. There's all this like, you get into all of the like power differential stuff of international politics and like who we help and who we don't help.
Yeah, that's true. There's definitely a political element to it. It just seems suspicious at the same time. Yeah. I'm trying to find an article because I swore that there was a sabotage recently on Iranian facilities that maybe it was just the Stuxnet thing where Israel special agents Hamas or whatever it's called, not Hamas, what's the name of
Mossad,
yeah, I always confuse the two. That they recruited people and paid them just to sabotage the thing, and then I could have sworn it happened recently, but maybe I'm misremembering that completely.
Yeah, I mean the stuff that has been targeted by Israel, either like physically or digitally, has been the enrichment process. So it's like centrifuges.
I was going to ask something. I don't want to really talk about Chernobyl because I think everyone knows a lot about Chernobyl, but I did have a question. I know there's a sarcophagus on the building. Do you know if that's stable nowadays? Because I heard that the sarcophagus was breaking down.
Yeah, I think that they're building another better sarcophagus now, because the original one was literally just like dump as much concrete on it as you can, which is like great, but it's exposed to the elements and all that, and it is also still being irradiated from inside. But like, yeah, I mean the radioactive release from the core at this point is not as bad as it was when it was actively on fire, which again is kind of a dumb tautology because like, yes, of course. But you can work around that site a lot easier now than you could when it was actively burning. You know what I mean?
Of course. Yeah.
So like the ability to build a new sarcophagus is not as hindered as it was originally.
Yeah, the original efforts by the what they call them automatons or whatever they call the
Yeah,
crew.
the like human robot or something.
Yeah, they had a special name for him, and it was pretty depressing. But that whole thing where they cleaned up, that was must have been a crazy, crazy time. Did they have any predictions for when the area of Pripyat, or whatever the city is called, will be inhabitable again? Or
It's probably still going to be a long time.
yeah,
Now, can you describe the difference between the fallout or reactor meltdown that happened at Fukushima? Like, as a difference of reactor design?
Yeah, it's partially reactor design because those were American-built reactors at Fukushima.
Oh, really?
Yes, and also this is one of the big problems with talking about nuclear power in terms of like evangelizing for it, is that there's been relatively few serious nuclear accidents. The technology is not that old. Like we're still under a century of being able to actually like reliably harness fission. But there's the problem of like Fukushima was the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl, which is a true statement, but it's also like saying this cold I have is the worst medical issue I've had since they had to amputate both of my legs. Like they're true statements, but the magnitude is so wildly different.
So were they, when they cleared out the city in their surrounding area, that I assume that was then out of abundance of caution?
Yeah, I think I don't know what the status is on the exclusion zone at Fukushima right now, but Fukushima especially gets into kind of the weird gray area between what is a nuclear disaster and what is like an industrial accident that involves nuclear stuff. Because and this is again, there's still a ton of reactors of the identical design to Fukushima Daiichi
Mm-hmm.
that are running in Japan, that kept running through the tsunami without issue.
Mm-hmm.
The problem was Daiichi had all of the backup generators at ground level. Like that's literally the only difference between that plant design and one that's like located in the same area. Those backup generators were above ground level, so they didn't get knocked out by the wave.
Mm-hmm.
And the other big issue with Fukushima was that it was more about the spent fuel pools than it was necessarily about the actual reactors. Like it's bad. I mean, people kind of understate it because it didn't like really go up, but yeah, I mean, part of it's reactor design, and part of it is just that what happened at Chernobyl was like the core of the reactor was on fire and exposed to the open air, that's really hard to do. That's really, really hard to do.
pardon my ignorance, but was there a meltdown in that scenario as well in Fukushima?
Yeah, it was partial meltdown because the plant lost power. And part of this is also exacerbated by Japan has this weird like split grid in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently this plant is right near where that split happens. And so they brought they ran an emergency line there and they're like, we can't plug this into anything.
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot of factors outside of the fact that like the nuclear plant needs to have water to not get too hot that made it worse than it could have been. Similar story to 3 Mile Island, which is like they kept turning off the emergency coolant pumps because they wanted to avoid a situation in the coolant lines, which they probably could have ignored and just kept pumping water in and it wouldn't have melted down.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But also a lot of the radioactive release at Fukushima was into the Pacific Ocean, which again is bad. You don't want to be releasing your nuclear byproducts anywhere that is not an intentional place. But the Pacific Ocean is fucking huge. Like it's really big. And that stuff gets diluted.
So the impact is less as opposed to dumping it in, I don't know, drinking water.
English
source.
Channel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or even just atmospheric release. Like atmospheric release is the worst possible outcome.
Yeah, I remember hearing about how when Chernobyl had the meltdown that the West figured it out because there was readings in the atmosphere that were like 900 times, the normal for the particles that are triggered from a meltdown, the atomic particles, and they said, okay, something's definitely going on, right? So they figured it out.
Yeah, I don't. This might be apocryphal, but the story of the first inkling that something had gone horribly wrong was that a nuclear plant in Finland, I think, one of the workers went out for like a smoke break and set off a radioactivity monitor on his way back in.
Shit.
And so they shut the plant down, they like swept everything and then realized that the radiation had been tracked inside. And then they were like, oh, okay, that's bad.
Something happened, yeah. Oh, shit.
But yeah, I mean, that's another
bad.
thing is that like with Fukushima, there was all this stuff about like, oh, it's way worse, and they're telling us they're lying, like they're covering it up to make like you can't hide radiation releases. It's measurable unless every single person with a radiation detecting equipment all decides to lie about it. Like you can't cover it up.
Yeah, it's noticeable and it's traceable, right?
Yeah, and I mean it's not like it's traceable, like it's triangulatable. So you might not get the straight story about whatever happened, but like you can't hide a release of like noticeable radiation.
That makes sense. So, gentlemen, we have quite a lot of audio so far. I just wanted to maybe switch the topic a bit and take it back to the personal question that I was going to ask towards the beginning of the podcast. Yeah. So, what is your stance on nuclear energy? Are you pro, against, or neutral? And whoever wants to start, feel free.
I'll go first. I guess I think it could be a solve. It's sort of an interesting juxtaposition, or a two-sided coin or multi-sided die or something. But essentially, my thought is like, well, yeah, it could be our solve to the climate crisis. The problem is that they take, I don't know, Asher can probably correct me, but like 30 years to make a safe one, and then it's like, well, we don't really have that much time to gear up. And the other part is like the cost per megawatt is getting overtaken by other sources.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not a surprise that I'm like pro nuclear power, but
Sure.
yeah, it takes a very long time to build because it's got an incredibly onerous permitting process. The reason that it's more expensive per kilowatt hour is partially that permitting process. Like I'm pretty sure that cost takes into account the entire cost of building a brand new reactor from like a blank site, which is wildly expensive. But it's the easiest way to produce baseload power that produces no direct greenhouse gas emissions. You have to mine for the fissile material, but you have to mine, like the process to make solar panels and windmills is also very like carbon and energy intensive.
Sure.
Like when it comes to the generation, the only byproduct that you get is steam.
Yeah, nuclear waste, right?
Yes, but we've also another problem is that we are still building reactor designs from the 50s. Like PWR and BWR reactors have not changed a ton since we first were like, okay, this works, let's use this. And there are better, newer reactor designs that have way less radioactive byproducts as waste products. And there's even like Fermi One was a fast breeder reactor, which creates more fissile material in the reactor than it takes in fueling. So
really?
minuscule tiny amounts. Yeah. And it's like there's newer designs that burn the fuel more efficiently and more completely. There's also a bunch of processes you can do to the waste fuel to burn it in different reactors. Part of the problem is that China is in the lead on nuclear research because their government is willing to spend a ton of money to do it. Whereas in the US, we want to do all these public-private partnerships, which it's like healthcare. I think that the market economy is incompatible with a properly functioning nuclear power program.
Yeah.
Because you cannot cut corners for profit. You cannot at any point be like, can we make this cheaper?
Right, you got to be safe. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. I mean, the government isn't willing to spend that much money on like a public works program so just because I have it open, I have the Fermi reactor cost in front of me. It's $6 billion in 2007. So it's like, and that's one, right? So it's a much easier debate when there isn't one of like, we're just going to spend this money and the reactors are going here. And it's going,
but also part of it is like, again, this is now getting into politics, but it's the way that we set up the like what will we reward and what will we punish in terms of regulatory frameworks, where it's like you can build a nuclear plant which will run for 40 years and generate X amount of milliwatt or megawatts or kilowatts, however much they make for your grid, and you can amortize that cost over this incredibly long time frame with a properly built reactor. Or you can spend 30% of that money and build just the shittiest, most garbage-ass coal-burning plant that will create enough power for whatever grid you're trying to hook it up to will be way worse for the environment, way worse for the people who live around it, way worse on an ongoing basis as they pull the coal out of the ground, but will not cost you like $8 trillion in permits because the regulatory capture that the coal industry has exerted over the United States government.
Well,
and the same goes for natural gas and oil burning plants.
Yeah, you make a great point. Is there's no ingrained long-term cost. There's no overhead beyond like I'm pulling it out of the ground. There's no cost of like future. There's no like carbon offsets or whatever. Like I don't know what to call it.
Like nuclear power plants they have an incredibly high upfront cost, and then the operational costs are way lower. I believe. I might be wrong on that, but it is like once the reactor goes critical, you have to pay highly trained technicians to run the plant, but there's not a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, you're just sticking rods with shit in a reactor, right? I mean, oversimplifying. Yeah. I wanted to say that my perspective is that I actually am not a huge fan of nuclear power, but I think it's a necessary thing for the next 20 to 30 years until more places build more, for example, wind and offshore wind farms, that kind of thing. And I have a site in front of me. We can put the link in the description maybe, but it was a study done by, it was published in Nature Energy, which I guess is a journal or a magazine or something like that, talking about the effectiveness of all the different materials, So they're measuring by the grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, and for coal plants and gas plants with carbon scrubbers installed, then for every kilowatt hour you're producing 109 grams of CO2, and for gas it's 78, hydro energy is 97, and surprisingly bioenergy is 98 grams. Compare that to nuclear, which has 4 grams, so whatever it is, 25 times less than coal. And solar comes in. Solar is actually more expensive because it's taking into account the process of constructing the solar panels. So it's 6 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. And wind is also the same as nuclear with 4, also taking into the account of building the big ass turbines, right? So I think nuclear in general is pretty good. It's just the byproducts that take so long to decay, and the very, very, very minimal chance that something goes wrong,
I don't think it's the end of history in terms of power generation. Like geothermal is probably better in a lot of ways, but you can only put it in certain places. But right now, it's the best option we have. And the reason it's the best option is because we've oriented the world in such a way that we have not been trying to get anything better.
I mean, the U.S. has like almost no wind generation power in comparison to like literally any other.
Yeah, because we're a country full of idiots who let idiots tell other idiots how to do things.
Yeah, it's. But going back to your point, Asher, is like in China they can build whatever the fuck they want because there's essentially no one to tell them no.
But they're also willing to just be like, your objection is stupid and we will not listen to it. Like, look at the Cape Cod wind farm is like 24 very rich people who live on the beach up there. Like on certain days I might be able to see like a hazy blob on the horizon, and and so Massachusetts is like, all right, I guess we won't build it. And it's like, that's a bullshit reason to not build it.
It's
like they should have just been like, cool, we don't care, and done it anyway.
Yeah. Here when you drive through the countryside in Germany, you see wind turbines everywhere. But in the US, I can only remember certain places that I drove through, I would see them, but it was really rare. So.
Yeah. I also think wind turbines look cool as hell. Like I would gladly be able to look at a turbine farm.
I've been known to watch them myself, So is there anything that you guys want to say as last words for this podcast, this episode?
I will say, if this is at all interesting to you, I cannot recommend enough the book Atomic Accidents by James Mahaffey. You can get it on Amazon or wherever. It's not like a academic textbook. It's amazing. It covers all of this stuff. The newest edition goes all the way up to Fukushima. Very good.
Is it kind of like novelized or?
It's like a survey of this stuff, and it does get it. He gets into some of the chemical processes, but it's not a book for scientists. It's a book meant for like interested lay people to read, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
Sounds interesting for sure. And I can tell you're pretty knowledgeable about the subject, possibly through this book as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I have my Wikipedia PhD in nuclear engineering.
Nice. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. So I'll just say to all our listeners, thanks very much for listening. And I'm sorry that you had to hear all of that.
Yeah, very sorry. Thanks again to Asher.
Hey, thanks for having me.